Tully Potter, I'm very glad that you're here in Riehen. Thank you very much. I'm Egidius Streiff and I'm presenting to you an exhibition on Adolf Busch and Rudolf Serkin. Tully Potter, you've written a big book about Adolf Busch. Could you tell us why should we know about Busch nowadays?
I think because he was a great example in many ways. He was an example of a musician who tried to be very pure in his own way, and he carried this principle through everything he did. It wasn't only his music making and his violin playing. He carried this consistency right through his complete life, and I think there are only a few people in every generation who are like that.
Of course, Adolf Busch and Rudolf Serkin were both German-based. Serkin was Austrian, and after 1933 they did not play in Germany anymore. Would you consider them political artists?
I've often thought about this. I think for Busch, if he had been left to himself, it's a bit like me. I grew up in South Africa. I would prefer not to be political at all. But because I experienced politics and injustice in South Africa, it made me political. And I think the same thing happened to Busch. I think that even things like the First World War, he was a very nationalist German. He was echt Deutsch, 100% German. But he didn't like some things that were going on even then. And I think that when Hitler came, this was too much for him. He had some Jewish connections. His wife was half Jewish, and he had a Jewish player in his quartet, and his younger brother, who was the cellist of the quartet, he married a Jewish girl. But I don't think that would have made any difference to Busch. I think he just saw these things absolutely clearly. He liked people because of what they were as people. He had Jewish friends, but he didn't think of them as being Jewish. And I should add that most of them didn't think of themselves as Jewish until Hitler came. They all subscribed to the same liberal German education that everyone else had, and they subscribed to German culture, supported German culture, and if they were in Vienna, they supported Austrian culture. They didn't think of themselves as being Jewish, but when you are put in a position where you have to choose, Busch always chose the correct path.
And he chose in 1939 they decided to move to America. Was this a good move?
Well, I think it goes back about 1 year to Italy, where they were very popular in Italy. Busch and Serkin were very popular, and the Busch Quartet were terribly popular, and his chamber orchestra. He'd started a chamber orchestra in 1935, and this orchestra gave concerts. They first played in Italy. He loved Italy, and he loved the Italians, and he loved playing Italian music. And you know, he played Pizzetti, he played Viotti, and he played a lot of Viotti. He loved Viotti. And then in 1938, Mussolini brought in racial laws, and Busch said, no, I won't play. And the whole of Europe almost, it was full of places he didn't want to play in anymore. I think Italy was maybe the last, as we say, the last straw. And he just felt the whole of Europe was polluted now with this fascism. So I think that his very beloved son-in-law and his beloved daughter, who are now married, they were making their life in America. He thought that America was going to be the promised land, and many Europeans did. So many people went to America as European refugees. I don't think it was a good idea. I think Busch would have been much better off in Britain, but Britain didn't want him. They didn't, nobody tried to give him a job there or anything. In America, he was very much appreciated by all the immigrants, you know, the European immigrants. So he was very much appreciated by them, but they didn't. America had been ruled musically by Germans and Austrians earlier in the century, and they had got a bit fed up with them. And they worshipped a lot of musicians. They worshipped Heifetz in the violin, Toscanini as a conductor, Horowitz as a pianist, and they had this very glamorous idea that, you know, you should be a virtuoso. Well, for Busch, virtuoso was a bit of a dirty word. He didn't like the word virtuoso. It wasn't that he wanted to play the violin badly, he always wanted to play well, but for him the music came first, and if he made a little mistake playing it or he was a little bit rough, that didn't worry him. But he had a completely different, his attitude to music was exactly opposite to the American attitude. And
which was?
Well, that they like polish, and they still do. And they appreciated the Budapest Quartet, who were good, but they didn't penetrate the music the way the Busch Quartet did. The Busch Quartet never had a decent career in America. Busch did quite well, really. I mean, compared with a lot of other very great people who went to America, had no career at all. He made his own career there. He had another chamber orchestra. He toured all over America with this chamber orchestra, and he gave a lot of concerts with Serkin, and they were appreciated as a duo. But Serkin's career was on the way up, and Busch's was on the way down. I mean, you must remember Busch was about 50 when he went to America, and in those days that was old for a violinist. So he should have been going along on a nice little plateau, and instead he was having to climb a new hill, you know, conquer a new place. He'd been quite successful when he went first to America in '31. They liked him, but of course he was a better player then. I mean, he was younger and he was at his absolute peak. He had a heart attack in 1940, which slightly affected his playing. After that, he always had a little question mark against his health. So there were all sorts of things. And he wasn't the sort of person who sat around saying, oh, I'm having a terrible time, or Rudy is doing better than I am. He never was jealous of Serkin at all. He loved the fact that Serkin was popular.
But towards the late 40s, they developed a new idea of a festival again, or of a summer camp or summer school.
Yes, I think Busch had dreamed of this kind of thing for 30 years already by then. In the early 1920s, he was always having ideas, oh, I would like to give up playing and I would like to do this or that. And he dreamed of having a place where you could just make music with no pressure. It would be summer, so the weather would be nice and everybody could play. And he dreamed of being able to bring amateurs and professionals together. Unfortunately, the very first summer, which was 1950, he was one day late arriving, and all the string players arrived, looked at this place and thought there was nothing going on and there were just farm buildings and things, and left. So there was only one string player which was Philip Megale, who only recently died. So the first summer there was really only one string player. There were lots of wind players because also the Noyes family were there, a famous family of two flautists and a violinist. And so a lot did happen that first year, but Marlboro nowadays counts its history from 1951. So
which is the second edition.
Yeah. So Busch had only one full Marlboro festival, and then he died just before the 1952 festival. So he didn't have a chance to really put his mark on it. You could see that it was born out of his idealism, but Serkin, when he carried it on, made it much more professional.
Well, of course, nowadays the pressure of professionalism, we feel it all, and it has to be perfect. Things have to sound well. But to come back to that basic idea, our premises are that if Adolf Busch and Rudolf Serkin would have stayed in Switzerland, they would have tried to do something similar here.
Oh, definitely. I mean, they were thinking of this all the time, and especially Busch. I mean, this had been a dream of his for many years, and he just didn't have the right place, and they were beginning to feel very threatened. You know, I mean, war was coming. Everybody knew another war was coming, and Hitler wasn't going to be satisfied. So that was why they left. But if Hitler had been somehow steered off in another direction, they might well have started something here in Riehen. Because I should say Busch loved Switzerland. He first came to Switzerland in 1912, and he fell in love with the country and the landscape, the mountains, everything about Switzerland. And he loved being in Basel and in Riehen because he's right next to the Rhine, and he grew up. The Rhine sort of ran right through his life, you know, like a sort of ribbon, and he was a Rhinelander.
Okay. So, you've seen our programs, and what do you think, as you've lived yourself so much into this personality Adolf Busch, what do you think Busch would think of our festival, and what would he tell us? What should he do?
Well, I think he would be amazed, because I think he would think he'd been forgotten, and that he should have been forgotten. I don't think he thought of himself as someone who would live forever. I think even towards the end of his life he got a little disillusioned and thought he would never be recognized as a composer, but now he is being recognized as a composer. Unfortunately, leaving Germany in 1933 lost him his audience for his compositions, as well as his biggest audience for his playing and so on. So I think that he would be quite amazed that there was a little festival going on in his memory, you know, anywhere in the world. And he would be pleased it was here because he loved this place.
So, in all these interviews, there are prepared questions. What do you think I have forgotten to ask you?
I don't know, really. Why did I get interested in Mr. Busch?
So, Tully Potter, why did you get interested in Adolf Busch?
Well, you and I know, because you play the violin and I listen to the violin, that every violinist has a voice. It's as unique as a human voice. Well, it is a human voice, but it's a human voice produced by this piece of wood and strings and so on, and a bow. I heard this extraordinary sound, and even now, today, when I hear Busch playing, it goes right through me, you know. It sort of gives me the shivers. And you can't, I get it from great singers as well, you know. I started as I hope a connoisseur of good singing. And so I loved him as a musician. And then I discovered that he had been a good man as well. He wasn't perfect. You know, he could get quite angry, he could be quite rude to people, but he was always absolutely straight, and he took a principled stand on everything. And I was saying just a few minutes ago, actually, that I have many friends, because I move among writers quite a lot, people who start writing about people, writing a book, or maybe even researching a composer, and by the time they've finished, they hate their subject. Well, for me, Busch hasn't been like that. I've got to like him more every day.
How do you judge his music? He considered himself a composer.
Well, I think he was taught by a very great musician, Fritz Steinbach, but he also learned from Max Reger, who became a great hero of his from when he was very tiny, before he even met Reger. He only met Reger in 1909, but already he and his brother Fritz had become great fans of Reger's music. And Reger was his model, but what I like about Busch is that when I read one of his letters that he's written, his German is very clear to me, and I don't find any long sentences. His compositions are exactly the same. He doesn't write long-winded things. He's always got a very concise idea of what he's doing. I think he was one of the very great contrapuntalists of his time. His counterpoint is wonderful in the string sextet, which is a great work, I think. The scherzo will surprise you because you'll suddenly realize it's a fugue. And the finale is a wonderful counterpoint. He does these things all the time. One of his 3 studies for orchestra that he wrote in the early 1940s. It's got the longest fugue subject that some of us have ever seen. He was an amazing, so he was technically extremely gifted, and he had a very great ability to judge the shape of a performance, which is what makes him a great performer, in the same way he could judge the shape of a composition. I used to be very worried about making big claims for him, and I still wouldn't want to do that. But I think that what he wrote after about 1920 is of very good quality. Up to then he was very influenced by Brahms and Reger. But you see him after about 1920, he's shaking off the Brahms. He still has the Reger sound, but he's more concise than Reger. I mean, Reger could be concise. If you think of the string trios by Reger, they're nice, concise pieces. Reger could write concisely, but very often he writes at very great length. And I think if you compare Busch's violin concerto to Reger's, you can get Busch's whole violin concerto into the first movement of Reger's concerto. And I think he had a conscious reaction against Reger as well as loving him. I mean, the Reger concerto was one of his greatest interpretations, and he even went to the trouble of reorchestrating it because he believed in that music so much, so he loved it. He wouldn't have wanted to reject the Reger concerto, but when he came to write a violin concerto himself, he made it much simpler and shorter. And I think when we finally get some good recordings made of his orchestral works, like the Capriccio, which is a marvelously witty work, I think we will appreciate him better. But the problem is that nobody will take responsibility for this. The Germans won't take responsibility for Busch. the Americans won't take responsibility for him, and the Swiss, although they do a lot, they haven't done enough yet. And
well, funnily enough, we have told the Swiss radio that Busch is after all a Swiss composer. And since the verdict on Busch's music is still out, I hope to fight for it. We are doing 2 performances of Opus 30, a big divertimento, and Opus 42, his Brandenburg answer with 2 gambas. So I hope we're going to get there.
I think it's important to look at him, because I think he was such an important person in his time, and his works were published by 3 leading publishers. So he was with Simrock and Breitkopf from Hertel and Eulenburg, and so he was appreciated in his own time, and other musicians played his music. And then in '33, he just cut his own throat.
What do you think? Of course, the first reaction to our request, if somebody would like to record Busch, was, well, of course we know he's Swiss, but is it any good? And do you think the reaction to him was similar, like that the Germans voted against Busch's music? That was clear after 1933, they didn't like his antagonism, but the Swiss, did they also react badly to that?
No, I think that a lot of his works got played, and it's very interesting to see how often Busch appeared as both violinist and composer in the same concert. And this happened everywhere. Andrea loved his music. Fritz Brun loved his music. Hermann Suter, he loved his music. A lot of he had a very high reputation in Switzerland, but he was a little reluctant to push his own music. I mean, to just give a good example of the string sextet, he did a first version which he gave the first performance in Germany in about 1928, and then he wanted to revise it. Well, of course, when he finally found the time to revise it, it was the summer of 1933. And so there was no question of publishing it, because he was now, he'd lost his publishers. And he never seems to have played the revised version. And this is such a fine work. It's already been recorded on CD twice, and it isn't even published. That's another problem, that 2 of his best works, the flute quintet with 2 violas, that's for flute, violin, 2 violas and cello, and the string sextet, because of some little argument about who has the rights, they haven't been published. But a lot of his works have been made available, and there are several recordings of the saxophone quintet, saxophone and string quartet, which I think is a very, very fine work. But there again, he seems never to have played that in public.
Of course, we are very grateful to the Paul-Sacher-Stiftung, who has supplied us with the parts, for example, of Opus 30, which would not have been available otherwise.
Yes. And
we're very grateful to have that source in Basel.
Yes.
It's a great luck for us.
I think the Sacher-Stiftung is marvellous, and they helped me a little bit with my book, and I think it's very important to have places like that really look after composers' interests. And I think that if Busch is given a chance, he will find his place. He will never be, Brahms or whatever, but he will be quite a good composer.
Thank you very much.